First, I want to say thank you for coming out in the snow. Thank you, Deborah, for that nice introduction. This is my home, Cambridge College, for 35 years. These are my friends, those that I haven't met yet, but many of whom have been with me for that 30-plus year journey. And it is a delight to be here now to be able to talk to you about this project that I'm involved in. This is actually what I consider the modern Black education movement. And it begins in the 50s through today. It counters that narrative called busing. It counters that narrative called that is built on white resistance. And it foregrounds a narrative that talks about what African Americans who lived in this city for many, many years, the beginning of the century, 20th century and on, did to have these schools desegregated and made fair. I embarked on this public history project in 2010, some 4 years ago, as a dissertation topic. The topic itself is usually an academic endeavor, but for me, it was a labor of love. I grew up in Boston and matured into an adult watching some of the most focused and dedicated social justice activists and educational justice advocates I have ever known. I journeyed for nearly 3 decades side by side with Ruth Baxon, a woman who was one of the most vocal advocates for desegregated schools and who documented the efforts of the Black community in her manuscript titled Boston's Black Education Movement. That's archived at Radcliffe Institute and Northeastern University. It was at this time, beginning in 1968, that I was introduced to one of the most powerful movements that attempted, as described by Tom Atkins, to save Black children from schools that were killing them. My research introduces the social justice movement that was the principal force for challenging segregated schools in Boston. Boston's Black activists led a movement to disrupt a social system centered in and bound by race. Racism was reinforced structurally throughout Boston by separated spaces and institutionalized in Boston's social, political, and public systems. And so I explored those separate spaces through the lens of the Black community by examining segregated schools. Because I knew all of those I interviewed, and each was more than willing to contribute to this history, it is considered insider research. Historians Valerie Yao identifies this oral history research, which are first-person accounts of history, as crucial to obtaining a picture of a total society. It is public space for voices of the, quote, non-elite who do not have memoirs or biographers. I ask these questions when I'm doing my research. Primarily what I'm looking for is how do Black Bostonians who are most impacted, as well as their children and members of the Black community, by segregated schools, how did they demonstrate agency, how did they demonstrate activism, which led to the court order to desegregate the schools? Given that those who were part of this movement were born before Brown versus Board of Education into a Plessy society, and that society was institutionalized as separate, was equal, and constitutional. What were the sources of resilience that nourished them in a segregated America and moved them to make changes? So who did I interview? Well, one of my heroes who sits here today, and I've known since the 60s, is Mel King. I have a deep and abiding respect for the many decades he spent working on behalf of communities in the cause of justice. Many know him as the mayor of the South End. I know him as a revered and respected advocate for justice, and fortunately, he was the first one to become my narrator. That opened up lots of doors for me. Along with Mel, I had 2-hour interviews with 16 other people, and 10 additional people have agreed to be interviewed for this project. People like Bill Owens, who ran the Gibson Liberation School and former Massachusetts state senator, and Ken Guskett, he's here. Do you have Bill Owens' picture? No, he's not here. Ken Guskett's picture is here. He was interviewed, president of Boston NAACP between 63 and 68. Barbara Birk was the first black director of the Clarendon Y, and I interviewed her because when the buses rolled, we had backup for kids going to Charlestown High, and they came to the Clarendon Street Y. Melissa Tillman, she was an educator and member of the New School for Children, one of the alternative programs that existed. Doris Bunty, Doris is here. She started as a tenant leader of Orchard Park and became CEO of BHA. Very involved. Judge Harry Elam, I was fortunate enough to interview him, and he passed about a week or so after I did the interview. I wasn't aware of how really ill he was, but I will always remember that when I walked into his house, he said to me, Lyda, I was about to call you to tell you, maybe I wasn't feeling good, so maybe I should have you come back. But he said, then I thought, no, I want you to come. I want to tell you my story. He was also writing an autobiography. Peter Parham, he's a Roxbury resident, and he was special assistant to the school superintendent, Marion Fahey, after the decision. Al Holland replaced him. Percy Wilson was at Roxbury Multi-Service Center, and those of you who live in the city of Boston knew that was very active. Rudy Pierce was part of Freedom House meetings. Alex Rodriguez was active in the South End of Boston. Matthew, Dolores Good, they were both people who lived in Roxbury and very active. Jean McGuire, many of you probably know. Jean's picture's not here either? No, okay. Jean McGuire was also in charge of Metco. Hassan Sharif was interesting. He's a Roxbury resident, but he was also mentioned in his entire family. If any of you have read Common Ground, and Common Ground is very controversial. Hassan was the only black family, and his sister was the sister that was talked about, written about in that. I had a 2-hour interview with Hassan. Bob Phillips, and then I have other people. Mike Haynes, I'm trying to get a hold of. Mel Help. So there are a number of people. I actually did talk to Lula Morgan, who is the Morgan versus Hennigan on the case, the Boston school desegregation case. She didn't know me, and the people that I did talk to knew me, and that's why the door's open. But I've since found another parent who does know me that I'll be talking to about the case. So Boston school desegregation story is one that, as Ruth Batson wrote, completely leaves out the struggle that was carried out for so many years by black activists in Boston. That started in the 50s. After Anthony Lucas received the Pulitzer Prize for his book Common Ground, Batson shouted from the pages of her manuscript, "John Anthony Lucas stole our movement." She countered that book completely left out the struggle that had been carried out for so many years by black activists in Boston. When the book was first published, many of them had labored long and hard in the battle for educational equity, felt as if they had been cut off at their knees, she said. And so my journey began. The better-known master narrative of Boston school desegregation starts with white resistance and busing. Busing is the means of transportation out of segregated education. It isn't school desegregation. What should be in the foreground would be the black community's activism and their contesting the unequal distribution of resources in Boston. This story illustrates the ways in which black children were schooled in Boston. On Friday, May 17, 1968, 14 years after the Brown decision to the date, Jacqueline, a 7-year-old first grader, was left in the cloakroom at 2:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon after school was dismissed. Her teacher confined her to the cloakroom shortly after lunch with tape placed across her mouth as punishment for talking. All students in the school were dismissed for the weekend, leaving, as the only adults on the premises, 3 teachers and a school janitor. I was one of the 3 teachers. We entered the first grade classroom to look at the dolls that same first grade teacher had the children paint. They were painted china white, faceless dolls decorated with black eyebrows, black eyelashes, blushed cheeks, and red lips. and they were lined up side by side in a row across the front of the room, facing the first graders. It was as if these dolls were to be a mirror for each child, who had been tasked with painting them. Thus, when this all-black classroom of first graders looked at the dolls looking back at them throughout the day, they were not looking at replicas of themselves or their artwork. They were facing white symbolic representations of a larger society within and without the building. Not one doll reflected any part of them. These first grade faces were shades of brown. The number of dolls equaled the number of children in that classroom. These dolls appeared to visually remind these children that they were not the norm in America, but rather one of the others. Schools are cultural contexts that have the power and the potential to promote students' cultural assets or other in a way that keeps them from creating meaningful academic identities. At the Dickerman, which was the name of the school, their otherness was reinforced in their artwork, through their white teachers and staff, in the use of racially insensitive secondhand books that they read, in their reading readiness tests that held a 1942 copyright date, and in the decrepit and one of the oldest school buildings in which they learned. While looking at the dolls, we heard a whimper coming from the closet and found Jacqueline. It was about 4:30 p.m. on a Friday. Jacqueline had been sent to the cloakroom by her teacher, and she was forgotten. School was over for the week, and we questioned what would have happened had we not stopped in that classroom. The school janitor told others that he would have eventually found her and sent her home. That was the official response from within the school building. We took Jacqueline to her mother, who was frantically searching for her in the neighborhood, as the school had been dismissed for a while. Her mother asked, what should she do? And we told her, contact the NACP. She did, and the Quincy E. Dickerman joined the other schools that had become public examples of discriminatory schooling in Boston. In 1964, the Massachusetts State Board of Education Advisory Committee on Racial Imbalance in Education reported on non-white enrollment in the Commonwealth's public schools. A close examination of 159 elementary schools in Boston continued to show a preponderance of non-white enrollment concentrated in black residential areas. The Dickerman was one of 49 racially imbalanced schools in Boston and one of 25 elementary schools with an enrollment between 81 and 100% non-white students. During 1966 and 1967, the Dickerman's total enrollment was 5 white students and 452 black students, with no more than 2 black teachers. With a 99% black population serving a predominantly black, low-income neighborhood, this elementary school, grades kindergarten through 6, had nearly an all-white teaching staff and a completely white administrative and support staff, including custodians. The NACP Education Committee report noted, nothing but radical change in the thinking of Boston school administration can provide the opportunities which Negroes demand. Further, parents were concerned that the schools were not preparing black children to compete educationally in an evolving society. As the city moved through the second half of the 20th century, too many children were receiving a substandard education within a crumbling infrastructure in underfunded schools with minimal resources and little political attention from the city. On June 11th, 1963, the NAACP presented 14 demands to the school committee to improve the quality of education for black students. Despite ensuing negotiations, the school committee denied the demand, stating, "We do not have inferior schools. We get inferior children." On June 18, 1963, the Massachusetts Freedom Movement organized a Boston school stay-up. 3,000 students boycotted the Boston schools. 8 months later, there was a second freedom stay-out, and 20,000 students boycotted the Boston schools. Many attended day-long freedom schools. In July of 1963, the black community called for picketing and sit-ins at the school school committee protesting the inaction of the 14 demands. The Boston movement gained momentum during the 60s as many civil rights organizations operated throughout the city for an equal place in society. They picketed segregated housing, they marched in segregated spaces, and staged sit-ins against segregated schools. While beginning its history as a city in the vanguard of publicly supported education, by mid-20th century, Boston also developed a tradition of systemic racism and educational neglect. It was a dual system. It segregated black and white children and institutionalized policies that perpetuated separate and unequal schools. Mel King, who wrote Chain of Change, provides a compelling account of shared community power with parent groups driving the engines of change. As Roxbury parents moved against segregated schools, parents became a central force as the movement entered the 1960s. They actively engaged schools through the sheer force of determination and organizing power. This activism took form in different ways. Some activists organized parent groups to address unequal education that the children received in Boston schools. Those parents who directly confronted the failures of neighborhood schools identified themselves by the names of the segregated schools that their children attended. There was the Higginson parents, the Gibson parents, the many other parent groups with those names, the Boardman parents, and all of those parents singularly and as a group fought to improve their schools, to tell their principals and their teachers, their school teachers, that these kids were worth saving. One last piece I want to say, because I just got that 5-minute signal, for 20 minutes, so I want to make sure that I get this last piece in. That there were a couple of areas that I think are important for you to know. There was the Gibson Liberation School. That school was the same school that you would probably hear about if you read Jonathan Kozol's Death in an Early Age. And although Kozol was a wonderful teacher, he was a substitute teacher out of Harvard and a friend, there was an even more powerful response, and that was the Gibson Liberation School. Bill Owens ran the Gibson Liberation School. What Bill and his family and those parents did was to walk into the substandard school and take it over, to liberate the school. They set in, they told the teachers that they told the principal and they told the teachers that they were taking over the school, and that if they chose to, they could stay. If not, they could leave. The next day that they came back, the police were there in full force, and they were told that they could not enter the school. What Bill tells as the story was that behind him were parents and children. So they decided that if they could not take over the school, then they would form their own school, and they walked away, and so did many of the teachers who taught in that school. That very day, in a line, Bill tells the story that he had no idea where he was going, but he was going to find a place, and he did. He found the Shaw House, if any of you are familiar with that. He found the Shaw House, and the parents, the kids, and the teachers went to the Shaw House, and they stayed at the Shaw House for at least the next 3 months, where these children got an education as part of the Gibson Liberation School. There was also Operation Exodus, founded on September 8th, 1965, that Ellen Jackson, who's not here, but I think you have a picture of her too, don't you? You don't have Ellen's picture? Oh. Anyway, somewhere I do, but somewhere, you just don't have it up here, yeah. And Ellen Jackson was the heroine for the Operation Exodus. And the important thing for you to know about Operation Exodus was that they used covert means. The parents obtained a list of empty schools, not empty schools, but of under-enrolled schools. The school committee had an open enrollment policy at that time, and they claimed to the state, who was overseeing them, that children can go any place where there were seats. So they got a list from some friends of where there were seats, and they rented buses, and they took these children to these empty seats in South Boston and other places in the city. And thus began Operation Exodus. But what was interesting was what was waiting for them there. Very often they were not welcomed in these receiving schools, even though it was legal, it was open. The doors were locked when they arrived. In others, children were separated by race. Some administrators unbolted and removed desks from the classroom, so there were no empty seats. This resistance further solidified the racial divide in Boston. METCO was founded in 1965. So the way I'll close this, since I got my 5-minute piece, is a piece that I wrote in the Globe. And it said that school desegregation did not start on June 21st, 1974. Boston's Black education movement, chronicled by Ruth Batson, brought the Morgan v. Hennigan case to federal court. The movement had its roots in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. The federal district court decision, which was upheld by the U.S. Court of Appeals, confirmed that Boston schools were unconstitutional. He wasn't a judge who flew down, the angels guided him into the federal courts, Judge Garrity. It was a constitutional decision, and the Boston School Committee was in violation of the United States Constitution, based on the Brown decision. So the Boston narrative should not be one of a traumatized city because of buses. Black children were being transported away from traumatizing, overcrowded, and ill-equipped public schools to better resource schools throughout the city. This was for a fair shot at better educational opportunities. There is a much deeper and more authentic history of school desegregation than what is written generally today, especially since we just passed the 40th anniversary. Leadership came from those most seriously impacted by Boston's segregated schools. It came from the Black community. The leaders in this struggle were Black Bostonians: Ruth Batson, Paul Parks, Mel King, Tom Atkins, Royal Bowen Sr., Bill Owens, Ken Guskett, Ellen Jackson, and hundreds of others, too many to list, Black and white, young and old. There were organized Boston high school student movements, parent movements, alternative schools, liberation schools, freedom schools in the Roxbury, North Dorchester, and South End areas, all working against segregated education. In 2015, the legacy should be about a Black community steeped in pride and purpose. We were saving our children from schools that were killing them. Boston school desegregation history should herald the long, hard work